Welcome into Props and Hops. I'm your host, Matt Landis, joined this week by professional bettor Porter. We're going to have a fun discussion on betting baseball's new rules this upcoming season, also touching on props, a specialty of Porter's. We can speak to the NBA, the upcoming NFL draft, as well as any other sports where he's seen some recent edges. I think we also have plenty of material for a fun gambling Twitter conversation this week. And Porter, when I'm talking with you, I know your insight on process is about as good as it gets. So we'll definitely weave that into the conversation as well. Excited to get to it. Porter, welcome back to Props and Hops.
Hey, Matt. Thanks for having me on again. It's been a little bit.
It's been a minute. I think we were talking right before we got rolling. It might have been October of 2021. So coming up on a year and a half, we're overdue. And I'm glad we can make this happen before opening day in Major League Baseball, because we've got some big rule changes that I'd love to just dig into with you right now and see where we can uncover some potential betting value, especially early in the season. You're a lot closer to this than I am, so check me if I'm misspeaking in any way. But in my head, there are kind of four primary rule changes that I'll be keeping my eye on, and that would be the pitch clock, the shift being banned, the bigger bases, and the limit on pickoff attempts. I think disengagements might be the proper term, but basically you're not going to see as many pickoff attempts this coming season. And let me know if I'm missing anything that's noteworthy, or overall with these changes in baseball that everybody seems to be really excited about as a fan. Beyond an entertainment perspective, do you see any betting value that we might get when it comes to the rule changes impact on scoring and prop betting?
Yeah, so definitely MLB decided the games are too slow and too boring for the casual fan. And they thought, what can we do to accelerate the game and sort of showcase the talents of the players more? And as analytics became more and more prevalent, it seemed like on the defensive end, they were able to really slow down and shut down a lot of players. And these four changes that you mentioned, they've been put out there to increase the offense in baseball. So there's kind of two components to betting. One, obviously, if MLB is trying to get a result for more offense, at least at the beginning of the year, before teams figure out what to do, which eventually is going to happen, you probably want to go hard if you believe that these changes are substantial and they're really going to make a difference. So, the pitchers only having 15 seconds with guys not on base, but more importantly, the 20 seconds with guys on base and the disengagements, yes, how often they're allowed to throw over. It's definitely going to basically allow the guys who are fast or, particularly good at stealing bases, steal more bases. And the shift is probably going to affect contact hitters more than power hitters, where you're definitely going to see a bat angle change. I forget what the current normal trajectory is, but you're going to see players aiming down a lot, not down, but more flat than were in the past. So for the contact guys and speed guys, these are going to be substantial changes. Now the question is, does it really matter if there's changes if the market has adjusted numbers for it? So obviously everyone's already talking about this, but I would tend to say that the books are probably slow to react. So if there is any edge, and you really will only know at the opening day, opening week, the time to go and hit those plays is at the beginning before there's lots of information. Because really, what good is it when there's 95% of the data out and you're operating at 90%? You're way better off when you have, even 50% of the data and there's only a good 25% of the data out there. So if you're going to make a play on some of these offensive ideas where a little bit more contact and a little bit more stolen bases, then it's important to probably take a shot at this at the beginning and not be hesitant if you're going to do so, then kind of wait to see what's going on and let the lines adjust.
So it sounds like your thesis would be this probably will lead to more scoring and perhaps some value in certain prop betting markets. And there's going to be a lot of uncertainty baked into this from the beginning. But if you want to capture an edge, you kind of have to embrace that uncertainty. And if I'm connecting the dots properly, I'm thinking of things like, again, full game totals will probably be very quick to become efficient. But if you're going to look over, you probably want to look over sooner rather than later. And then from a prop betting standpoint, if we're going to see less emphasis perhaps on the launch angle, more emphasis on contact, things like strikeout props to go under. I know some books will post, even for individual players, if we're talking about like an Aaron Judge or a Mike Trout, will they hit a home run in this game? Yes or no? The no is, even in a juiced ball, pre-rules change era, those no's were pretty heavily juiced, and that can be unsettling for some bettors. But maybe even with what seems like a lot of vig, it's not going to be juiced high enough if we're seeing a lot more emphasis on contact and balls in play versus everybody swinging for the fences. So maybe a look at strikeouts under, no on those yes or no home run kind of props. Or maybe even something like runs, hits, errors. I know that's a big prop. And if we're going to see probably more base hits and presumably more scoring in the game, possibly some overs there. Again, to your point, it all comes down to the price at a lot of these books. But of all those things that I've mentioned, does anything seem like it might be particularly worthwhile for people to look into attacking early on this
Yeah,
upcoming season?
the changes are probably going to occur more so towards the contact hitters than the home run hitters. You're just going
Right.
to see those guys not aim for this, aim for the skies. I don't know if Judge is going to change his approach to
Good
either
point.
striking out or hitting a home run, but a lot of these like mid-tier guys are, and there's going to be a lot of noise out there probably with the shift. But you have to remember, these are major league athletes, pitchers. First of all, the vets are going to adjust probably quicker than the new guys, or guys that are only in a season or two. It's the same thing you saw with Spider Tack. You saw kind of like there was these two group of vets, either these guys who had no chance to change because they've been abusing the Spider Tack for so long, and you had the vets that were adapting and having new pitches in their arsenal, while the these guys a couple seasons in weren't as greatly affected. And I think you'll sort of see that with the pitchers here too. So this is again something early to kind of strike on because they're going to figure out this what to do with the shift. I saw them playing outfielders in very strange positions, mimicking the shift. So there might be like an overreaction, honestly, overall, because at the end of the day, they're just going to make adjustments. But if the change is really drastic, then MLB might even make a slight change back where you don't want to see. I mean, some people do, but it's not good for the game if it's 9-7 every single game. So while you'll see changes, I would be hesitant as a fan and a better to really just down the line, even after a month or a few weeks, to really just keep hammering these angles that you thought you might have had at the beginning of the season, because as sure as you're adapting, the books are adapting.
And that's one of the next questions I wanted to ask you. You led perfectly into it with baseball being kind of the ultimate sport when it comes to sample size and having clean data to work with. What are you going to be looking for early in the season when it comes to measuring the signal versus the noise with some of the initial results that we get coming into a new era with these new rules?
Right. So, it's more based on the line being offered than the adjustment of the rules. So the goal is not to force, is it the stolen bases? Is it the hits? Is it the home runs? The goal is to see where the book is making the mistake, not where you're analyzing and finding the most changes, because maybe the book has made the most changes. So where you might have the smallest amount of change in a result might still be the greatest spot to bet, because it's more dependent on what the book is doing than what you're doing.
Love that. I think that that's a really good place to leave things off as we start to get ready to bet baseball. Perhaps a lot in these upcoming 6 months, perhaps not so much for some of this audience that tends not to bet baseball a lot, but maybe some good food for thought, at least early in the season. Porter, I know that opening day in baseball is far from the only thing going on in the sports world right now. When it comes to other areas you're betting a lot, I think there are a few things that we can dig into from a prop betting standpoint. And let's start with the NBA. It's an interesting time of season where, unlike early season baseball edges, we might see basketball is, pretty efficient when we're talking about NBA markets this time of year. So when we look at, late March into early April throughout the playoffs, how would you describe your prop betting approach for the NBA?
Yeah, so there's no question that as the season progresses, and this is in every sport, not just NBA, the market becomes more and more efficient, not unbeatable, just more efficient than before. And part of being a good sports bettor is having other avenues and things to bet. So there's still plenty of other things, going on right now. You have NASCAR head-to-heads. You have MLB spring training, which a lot of it has to do with news, but that's part of betting. It's not just handicapping. There's so many other components to turning a profit. Soccer props are still going pretty strong. Um, But in general, you're going to start seeing a lot of tanking this season, this part of the year for the, I can't say his name right ever, Wananabe, draft. So it's really hard on some of these, Spurs, the Thunder, Houston, hard really to gauge what they're going on. So I would say definitely during this part of the season, volume ticks down. And, it's just like everything seasonal kind of, go up, go down. Sometimes there's a ton, sometimes there's less. What's important is not to force things when they aren't there and just to have your head on right and, you know, just stick with the process.
You mentioned the NBA being pretty tough to gauge, but I get the sense that as we get more news and as markets start to develop a bit more, the NFL draft, not so tough to gauge for a better at your level. What are you anticipating when you think about this year's NFL draft betting market?
Yeah, so look, NFL draft betting market, I don't want to give all the alpha away, but just do a lot of searching on Twitter and it really shouldn't be hard to turn a profit. I know it's hard to trust certain sources. You got two guys that like to compete with each other. I think everybody knows out there, these two reporters. But in general, you're just going to see a lot of slow moving markets and you need to jump. There's too much. Many times you'll see a bettor just be very hesitant to not take a shot at something. And sometimes, especially in these once a year markets, you really just got to start clicking buttons when the news comes in. Sometimes it'll be right, sometimes it'll be wrong, but overall, it's going to work out in these really slow moving, inefficient markets. I mean, the NFL draft is the gift that keeps on giving, but there's plenty of touts out there that notice that too, and they love posting when there's $12 limits on MGM, what guy's going where, and take this and take that. So it is important to, things are changing. Things are changing all the time, and it's really important to just be ready to adapt.
And when it comes to adapting, being ready to fire on news pretty quickly with a draft betting market, talking NFL, I think we'd be remiss not to think about something else that people probably came across if they were actively searching Twitter over the past few days. And that would take me to a current big topic across gambling Twitter, Steve Fezzik and March Madness, noting that he was looking to bet pretty heavily on Purdue, laying minus 4,500, so $45 to win a dollar essentially. And last Friday, the morning of the game, his tweet read, trying to decide how much I should invest in Purdue minus 4,500 money line, 99% plus bet, good value. I think we all know how that turned out. Purdue became the second one seed to go down in the opening round of the tournament. And Right Angle Sports on Friday night, after that result came in, noted the amount of views and engagement that Fezzik tweet was getting and wrapped it up by saying, it's crazy how much this community enjoys seeing others fail. Let's be better. So, Porter, I feel like that opens the door to two topics of conversation that I hope we can add value to for this audience. Betting value when it comes to extreme vig. Is that value even worth it? Is that value even there? How do we quantify it? And also whether or not sports betting truly is a community. And first off, I'd like to touch on the notion of betting value that's there or perhaps not there in the eyes of the beholder when we're talking extreme vig. When we're talking about something as juicy as 45 to 1, what's your process with ascertaining the level of value that's in the equation or perhaps not part of the equation?
Right. So it really depends if your betting is for yourself or if you're betting for partners. There's a lot of things to take into consideration. I always like to say not every win is a win and not every loss is a loss. There's a lot more components in betting when you're betting at scale than just is this play plus EV. So I have no idea what the actual true odds for Purdue should have been, but assuming that Fezzik is right, then making plus EV decisions over time, you're going to turn a profit. You're going to go through some nasty, experiences. Obviously, this one being one of them. But most of the time, and I noticed that he noted it later, you should be betting within your bankroll. So whatever it is that you would bet on that play shouldn't really have drastically affected you in a way where it's ruined your season. If you're putting 45 units on this play, I'm all for consumer protection, but honestly, sometimes people just need to take personal accountability. That's why people love touts, actually, because they take the onus of the responsibility and put it on someone else. It is so much easier to click when someone else is telling you to do it than when you've put in the hard work. Because think about it, sometimes you put in the hard work and you lose 45% of the time, right? So that's pretty mentally draining. But when you kind of remove that psychological, emotional component of it and put it on someone else, it makes it a lot easier to click. In general, when you're betting kind of in the business that I'm betting in with partners, you have to think about the backlash you're going to get if you lose a 45-1. I mean, look at the engagement on that post. You're going to get a lot of people questioning you. Is it really worth winning that play if some percentage of time you lose that play and they just outright take the accounts away from you because you're a lunatic betting negative 4,500, even if they're plus EV? So it's not just so clear cut always that you see a positive expected play, you click the button. It's just not that simple in sports betting. Now, for the community part, I guess community, it sort of means, I mean, if you just go by the definition of community, then you're right. There are definitely groups of people that gather, kind of talk about bets, help each other, and then proceed forward with whatever they're going to do with that information. Bet it, sell it as picks, whatever. There's communities in the Tau community. There's communities in the betting community. But I think it more boils down to, and this, I keep seeing this conversation about a zero-sum game, whether it is or it isn't. And I kind of have to go into a few stories to make it clear, to make my example more clear. So let's say you're betting with a local, and this local is probably a kid, and he has 20, 30K to his name. And this guy has, I don't know, 30 players, 40 players. And one of these guys just happens to, click buttons and hit a 5-6 game parlay, $500 bet. And, this guy just lost 3/4, 2/3, 3/4 of his bankroll. If you can't see in that example how rooting for other people and hoping that other people succeed is, not in your best interest, I really don't know what to tell you. I mean, it's very clear that your odds of not getting paid increase if the book's bankroll decreases. What's crazy about this is the same in the legal landscape. You should see some of these books, how hard it is to get your money off there once you're a winner. And rest assured, if Barstool didn't have their endless army of stoolies losing, whatever, some crazy hold they have over there, it would become more and more, you would see less and less good markets offered. You would see less and less flexibility from the book, because at the end of the day, that side needs to win. So while there's nothing wrong with rooting for a casual, to hit some big score, the notion that it doesn't affect the betting and the results that you're going to get from books, it's ludicrous. The only possible way to say that is if you haven't experienced it. And here's the major issue. You have people online talking as if they're authority while they've never even seen some of the gambling spaces, like the PPH side of the business. And what's the problem with that is the PPH side is bigger than the regulated markets. So all of a sudden you have someone speaking with a ton of authority, but not a ton of experience. So and honestly, there's nothing wrong with that. It's more like the blind leading the blind. It's not, bad intent. It's not like these people are, I mean, obviously some out there that are just trying to scam their customer out there for as long as they can. And their goal is to be successful networkers. But it's really just more blind leading the blind. If you don't have experience in something, then you just don't know. It's pretty simple.
Circling back to the point you made about this ultimately being a zero-sum game, I think you laid it out really well. And at the same time, if it's okay, I'd like to see if I can play devil's advocate for just a moment here, because while I fully understand that the notion of this being a community where we should be rooting for other people kind of goes out the window if you have a head-to-head bet with somebody else. It's different if you win and I lose, or vice versa. Then suddenly there's a lot more competition in this dynamic. But I'm assuming that a lot of people, using the Fezzik Purdue example specifically, most people piling on him probably didn't bet Fairleigh Dickinson on the money line in the ballpark of 20-1. So do you have any thoughts on, when we see something that gets this high profile in our little world of gambling Twitter, how much of this might more be targeting a certain person versus targeting a certain process?
Right. So when a person, and I honestly, I'm not an expert on this, but when a person has a questionable history, that it's a lot easier to pile on the person when it's a person that's really, straight shooter. So you get this angle of maybe people piling on a little bit harder, and this applies to a lot of people. It's not just any one person. There's a wide range of people piling on anybody, kind of rooting against them, or not wanting to take accountability when something is lost, so blaming them. But zero sum game, the question that you're asking about in the example that I gave, that's just the actual betting and being paid out. There's a million other types of games going on here. For example, my personal business thrives when big groups, touts, people selling picks, syndicates are getting crushed betting sides and totals. There's just more variance in that market. So while they might have a great edge, you're going to go through a lot bigger swings. Here's a perfect example of a zero sum situation. As sides and totals are losing, I magically get more accounts because people are looking for less variance. And as sides and totals are crushing, because those markets are more accessible, bigger, more fun to sweat, more interesting, I'm magically losing accounts or not receiving as many. So, like, this is just, there's no question that there are multiple different games going on in the sports betting business. It's not just the clicking of winning and losing. It's not just the collecting money and paying money. There's a million other components when you look at it from like the 1,000-foot view. When you look at it from the 1-foot view, it's a lot more simple to say there's a community going on here and people helping. And don't get me wrong, just like in any other industry, there's a lot of altruistic people out there that are really good people that are really trying to help. But there's also a lot of misguided people, not intentionally misguiding people. They're still good people. They're still honest people. They're just making mistakes that they don't know that they're making. Or they have different goals and aspirations. So I would say before deciding all of these things, like, is this info good? Is this info bad? I would actually say the largest problem, the biggest problem most sports bettors have is they don't know what their own goal is. And even if they think they know what their goal is, then they don't take the route or the angle of trying to achieve those goals. There is a very large segment of the population that's goal is to have fun. There is a large segment of the population where the goal is just to break even and hang out with friends and talk about a game. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just you, as whether you're on Twitter or watching podcasts, you need to decide what are your goals and do I sort of want to be involved with this person's perspective based off their goals? Do they align with mine? So once you're able to kind of make a self-reflecting decision about what you're trying to get out of this, then it's a lot easier to begin to understand who to listen to, what to do. It's not just so until you know for yourself, honestly, deep down, reflecting, it's really hard to even go the next step of what it means to win at sports betting, getting down on sports betting.
Yeah, I appreciate the insight there on knowing what your own goals are. And even for somebody at your level, understanding the impact that variance on markets like full game spreads and totals can have on your own personal business with more of a focus on prop betting. So, if I may try to harness all of this and tie a bow around the is it or isn't it a community part of this conversation, I would say that also at the start of your most recent answer, if somebody has a certain track record or has made statements that have perhaps alienated others in the past, I get where there can be an inclination to maybe, hit the gas a little harder when the time comes to bring some criticism. And at the same time, maybe this is just my own individual view, but I think the notion of celebrating someone else's failure, regardless of the circumstances, will often say more about you than the person whose failure that you're celebrating. And overall, if I can try to leave this with a positive spin, I think that it gets a lot more clicks, a lot more headlines, a lot more engagement overall, any metric you want to look at, to point fingers or try to really stoke the fire. In reality, I feel like we all have so much more common ground than most people want to let on. And it doesn't make for the most captivating debates. But I feel like if we can embrace that over time, even in a small way, if that could be my contribution to this space, it might mean I'd never have the biggest podcast ever or the biggest following ever. But I feel like just moving 1% in that direction could lead to a much healthier ecosystem, embracing all that common ground that we have that nobody seems to want to talk about.
Yeah, look, at the end of the day, operating in a net positive, emotionally like kindness way is almost always going to result in something better than operating in a negative behavioral way. It's just how, and I say this all the time. It's just how everything works. Forget sports betting. This applies to the game of life. So in general, some kind of positive angle, positive attitude is always going to trump, you know, piling down on people, being rude to them, offending them.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to move on to the topic of your own betting process, aside from everything going on in the crazy world that is gambling Twitter. And kind of along a similar vein, Porter, a few minutes ago, you touched on variance and how that can affect your own personal business. I think if we want to build on the Purdue example from last Friday night or Sunday night, TCU hitting a significant to some, as SVP would say, a significant to some last second three to cover versus Gonzaga when the outcome of that game from an outright perspective had already been decided. These are huge swings that affect a lot of people. And whether it's the impact that variance like that has on your business or just how you process these types of outcomes in your own betting on a more individual level, what would you say about the role of variance in your process as a professional bettor?
Right. So in general, no matter what variance you experience, and part of the problem with variance is that you start doubting yourself. But if you're confident in the process and you're betting within your bankroll, maybe 3, 4 years ago, I would get really down on some losses. But today it's just really important. I always feel, because I just have an obligation to so many people now, to just kind of move forward. And I always say this joke: if you're tilting, the key strategy is bet a smaller market where you just can't bet enough to break your bankroll. It's just simple as that. If you bet smaller than your bankroll and you're within means, it's just not going to send you on tilt. But if who you know I I come from a poker background, so I used to tilt back then. I would say it hasn't transferred almost at all to sports betting, but it would happen to me back in the day. I would say that in general, if you're tilting and sorry, if you've bet 50% of your bankroll, 40% of your bankroll, and a play loses, no matter how good it is, everyone is tilting. You are guaranteed to go broke. It's not the next bet that sent you broke. It's the action of tilting that sent you broke afterwards. And people want like an easy solution. I'm not, there's lots of good books actually out there, especially in the poker world, about this the psychology of how things work and don't how not to tilt. A lot of this has to do with people believe they're owed something. I think that's where a lot of tilt comes from. It's I put in the work, I deserve a result. When if you can just kind of eliminate that I'm owed, I deserve mentality, then the next part that leads to that, the tilt, when something doesn't go your way, is much less likely to happen. And it's this overbearing feeling, I think happens in a lot of first world countries. This last 2 decades, people have been raised a certain way where it's just, you deserve this, you're owed this, a lot of participation trophies. And while there's nothing wrong per se with that part of it, the problem is what it leads to. And a lot of this I deserve mentality is probably what leads to a lot of people's tilt. And yeah, it's rough. It's rough. It's rough out there. A 70% event loses 30% of the time. You flip a coin in a sample of 100,000 times, you're going to get tails 300, 400 times in a row somewhere in there, and it's going to blow your mind. But in the grand scheme of things, it can happen if the sample's large enough. Just like things will even out if the sample's large enough, if you have a lot of volume. I know a lot of people, when they're doing bad, actually reduce their volume. But in reality, if you're finding edges, you should probably be increasing your volume. It's the same as poker. You're playing more hands. As long as you're playing them, in a plus EV manner, you're gonna actually realize your edge sooner. So a lot of like controlling the tilt again, I really think it has to do with a lot of mentality of being owed and deserving things. And it's not unique to sports betting. It happens in everything.
Yeah, that point about how to handle losing streaks, if you can say with a fair degree of confidence that you're following a sound process, doesn't mean that you should stop what you're doing or really try to scale down. Reminds me a lot of NFL 6 point teasers using that long model crossing through 3 and 7 this past season. Those were brutal for about the first half of the season. and they were lights out for much of the second half. So if somebody just got their butt kicked for 6, 7, 8 weeks and then pulled the plug, they missed out on a pretty nice bounty over the latter half of the season. And it's not always that clean. It's not always that easy. But Porter, as you talk about poker with a few references in your last comments and how to manage tilt, I'm reminded of betting beyond sports and a recent conversation you had on the Gambling with an Edge podcast with Bob Dancer and Richard Munchkin. One of the key points I think you made there that I would love to elaborate on in this conversation would be the notion of getting good at betting versus getting down as a bettor as you scale things up. I think you alluded to the fact that the first part of that equation, getting good, isn't enough if you can't master the art of getting down. So for bettors in this audience who are in the process of getting pretty good as bettors, but haven't yet overcome some of the key hurdles when it comes to getting down, what would some of your tips be for the latter part of that equation?
Yeah, so it's really difficult to sort of synergize both those skills because the individual that's going to be highly skilled at winning almost always, I mean, honestly, I haven't actually met someone who isn't this. So I know I'm always trying to be careful with my words, but maybe just to put more bluntly, if your background is not in comp sci programming, finance, mathematics, I cannot see a way to be good at sports betting in the long run. Of course, you can look at some anecdotal things, cross your arms, watch a bunch of games, go on a hot streak for 300 bets, be up 10, 20, 30 units and think you're amazing. But I know a lot of people in this space, and I just don't really know anyone with any longevity doing that. I'm sure I'm going to get comments saying that's not true at somewhere along the way. And maybe there's someone out there like that. But me personally, I just don't know them. And your question basically then begs that a lot of people who are good at the getting down or the winning are not the same people. So that generally means that you need to form relationships, or you've now over focused on one over the other, and now the same amount, because what does getting good mean actually? It means hundreds, if not thousands of hours of research, of programming, of understanding the advanced analytics. Are you sure that you put in 1,000 hours trying to get better at networking? Probably not. People are probably just hopeful that, hey, I'm a winner, let's go, and then just things will work out. But in reality, I bet a lot of the people that are good at getting at winning, or having some positive ROI, they just haven't put in the work to be good at getting down. And if that's the case, then it's either you spend the hours or you work with someone who's good at getting down. That's kind of, I know people want like a simple answer, but they're just unique skill sets that usually don't overlap. It just, it's not just in this, most networking people probably aren't that strong in math, science, they're probably humanities, business, English, whatever it is, it's usually two different types of people. So like this hope that you can just kind of magically become this, of course, with enough time, anyone with a, anything, with their head on their shoulders, they'll figure it out over time. But in reality, it's just two different skill sets.
You mentioned that people often want a simpler answer, and to me, that kind of implied that you didn't think your answer was very simple. I would counter in a way that I mean to be constructive here and say that your answer to me was pretty simple. It just wasn't easy. So maybe I'm just getting into semantics here, but when it comes to putting in the work or building the relationships, I don't believe in a lot of black and white dichotomies in this world, but that seems to be a pretty valid way to lay the framework for this equation. It just doesn't mean it's an easy path forward for anybody. And I think one of the best ways to go ahead and progress forward is to embrace the notion that this can be a really constant evolution. I mean, just because somebody has become a winning bettor doesn't mean they can become a professional bettor. Just because somebody's become a professional bettor doesn't mean that they're set for life and they don't need to continue to grow and adapt over time. So with that context in mind, Porter, since your first appearance on this show back in October of 2021, how would you describe some of the biggest ways that you personally have evolved as a bettor?
Right. So I think the last time I was on the show, I didn't really have an office, first of all. So now I have an
Mm.
office, where there's a team that's behind all the magic going on. And I think over the year, especially this last year and a half, I really started to notice that on the individual level, there are a lot of, okay, for the gambling community and the people that are kind of more in the know, there are actually a lot of winners out there. If you have a variety of accounts and there's a bunch of different lines and you have any kind of math inclination, you can figure this out. This isn't rocket science. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm fairly sure that as this becomes culturally more acceptable, you're going to get a young generation that's going to come in and wallop the old, but that's in every industry, wallop the old generation. It's just things being run more professional, more business-like, more analytics, more data. And actually, once the market is saturated with those individuals, you're going to start seeing the markets become much more similar to, stock market, bond market, other markets that are more efficient. I would say, though, overall, during this time period, I just kept noticing that the real movers and shakers are kind of the network guys, and that the power that the handicapper used to hold in this industry when it really was more difficult, at least on a large scale, to win, they were a lot more valuable. And today I've noticed the people that can kind of rein in the teams, rein in the groups, get a variety of sharps, putting in action. That's where really the power has shifted to in the last year or so. There's a lot of good tools out there with a lot of people who are able to win. So the question is, how do you kind of build a portfolio where people experience the most amount of upside with whatever I or deem or they deem, and once you start talking to them, with what level of risk and variance they're willing to take on. And then it's about optimizing the accounts for people. So
And
again,
in
yeah. So again, the biggest shift I see just over time is, and you'll hear this almost always from the top guys, it's just the power lies in accounts. Without accounts, like the best handicapper in the world with one Caesars account or whatever account is not as sharp, or sorry, is not doing as well as a mediocre handicapper with a variety of places to bet at. It's just, there's no longer these, in major markets especially, just massive edges. 100% of the time, whatever, let's use NBA as an example, whatever pre-news bet you had probably had like a 4, 5, 6, 7, 8% edge. But when James Harden is announced out and you have a variety of places to click, like Tobias Harris and Maxi overs, your edge with zero handicapping is significantly greater than the best player prop handicapper who handicapped a game that had no information changing. Now, there's still value in betting, games with no information changing, but this like skill of taking a lot of different components into betting has just become more and more crucial over time.
And for somebody who's listening to this conversation, let's say they're not in California like you and I. So maybe there are some regulated books, thinking Caesars, you mentioned, FanDuel, DraftKings, MGM, and so on. But some of the top regulated books can be just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the myriad of accounts that somebody could have access to if they really want to hustle. If somebody's an up and coming bettor listening to this conversation and they've really been sharpening that handicapping side of things, but they haven't yet gotten to the point where maybe they have enough accounts to maximize the value they can extract or make this endeavor as sustainable as possible, what would your top advice be to somebody in that kind of position?
Put a little bit less effort into handicapping and a lot more effort into networking. It's okay to miss a couple bets. It's okay to miss a couple days if in the grand scheme of things, you have a long-term goal of success in this industry. It's not just about trying to figure out how to win the plays. And if you're spending 90% of your time doing that and 10% of your time the other way, and your goal is, to bet at a large scale, then you're doing something wrong. Your other option, of course, is always to just figure out how maybe you don't like networking. There's plenty of guys who just, they don't enjoy that. They like being behind the computer, and that's in every single industry. There's plenty of guys at Facebook that like going out and making deals. There's plenty of guys at Facebook that like sitting behind the computer and, modeling, building apps. So it really comes down to self-reflection and figuring out who you are. And once you do that, it makes it a lot easier to figure out what to do next. And I mean, when's the last time you actually heard of a bettor who spent any time sitting down thinking, hey, why am I doing this? Hey, is this something I should be doing? I mean, maybe they'll hear that during a downswing when they're in doubt, but that's probably the worst time to start contemplating these kind of things. Best time is when things are going great. That's the time where you really have a chance to like evolve and improve. When you're like something, in the midst of a brutal downswing with variance, that's not the time to start self-reflecting. You need to make the decisions and and setting paths for yourself during the good times, not the bad times.
And when it comes to doing this kind of proper self-reflection, I will preface this by saying all good things in moderation. But for me personally and others I know, that's a good way to weave in the hops. And if I'm in a more pleasant environment with a good drink in hand, again, not too deep into the hops, but trying to take off the edge a bit and do some of that reflection with an optimal frame of mind, I would say that that's led to some edges that, any other type of approach or activity wouldn't have uncovered for me over the past decade or so plus that I've been doing this. Porter, weaving the hops into this conversation as we start to hit the home stretch here. What would you say you've been enjoying lately, if anything, that you can share from a, hoppier side of things?
Nice. Drinking and betting. No, I'm kidding. It's not bad. So I think last time I was on the show, I said a beer that basically doesn't exist anywhere except some fancy schmancy Bevmo's Hitachio White Ale. And still ringing on that theme of white ales, I would say, a beer that you can definitely find all over the place if you want to enjoy that type of beer is Allagash White. I think it's a little bit more simple for the white ales to find, but it's out there. It's a really good beer.
Yeah, I love that recommendation because I feel like that would be a good candidate for the Mount Rushmore of beers that might convert somebody who's used to the macro lagers, Bud Light, Miller Lite, Coors Light, into the craft beer side of things. White ales, I would say they have an elevated flavor profile relative to some of the simpler lagers. Not that there's anything wrong if you want to throw down, just a Miller Lite from time to time, knock yourself out. But if you want to delve into something that's, still very approachable, but perhaps a bit elevated, not too expensive, not inaccessible, but can really just open the door into the craft side of things, Allagash White is about as good as it gets. So, I have not, in the year and a half or so since your last appearance, I have not been able to find a Hitachio White Ale to try for myself, but Allagash White readily available just about anywhere. So I love that recommendation.
Awesome. Glad.
Well, Porter, I really appreciate all the time and insight here. I want to encourage everybody who's not doing so already to go ahead and follow Porter on Twitter at MLBK's Psychic. Porter, we've covered so much good ground here. Thanks again for rejoining the show. Before we go ahead and call it a wrap, is there anything that I've missed so far or anything else you'd like to add to this conversation?
No, I think I really appreciate being on your show, having me back on. It's always a blast to be out here. The last thing I want to leave the audience with is I keep thinking about what's kind of the core of what's going on here. What are people doing? What's sports betting, getting down, finding where to bet, winning. At the end of the day, this is a journey. And the people that you're listening to, they're all telling a story. And after a period of time, when you're in this industry long enough, it's important to start listening and understanding if they're telling a story that makes sense or a story that doesn't make sense. And at the end of the day, taking accountability and making decisions for yourself. And hopefully that message helps a lot of people moving forward when they run into situations where they're not sure what to do. Everyone's telling a story. You just have to listen.
Love it. Can't try to one-up you with a better way to close things out than that. So I will go ahead and leave it at that and say to the audience, thank you for tuning into this episode of Props and Hops. In the On Deck Circle, I will tease that as an annual rite of passage and backed by popular demand, next week will be the MLB Predictions Extravaganza with my dear friend Connor. We've done that every year that this show has been in existence, and we will keep that tradition alive and well. Excited to bring that all to everybody next week, right back here on Props and Hops.